The bell above the heavy glass door of sterling oak timepieces did not ring with a festive cheer. It gave a single, sharp, metallic chime that cut through the cold air of the room before dying out instantly against the soundproof fabric of the walls. It was exactly 3:42 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon in late November. Outside, the historic brick sidewalks of Grand Avenue in Savannah, Georgia, were bathed in that heavy, amber autumn light that makes the centuries-old oaks look like charcoal sketches against a golden sky. Tourists and wealthy locals moved in slow pairs past the boutique windows, their hands wrapped around cardboard cups of spiced lattes, their soft, polite laughter completely swallowed by the thick, laminated glass of the high-end storefronts. The scent of sweet jasmine, dying but still heavy, from the public square across the street drifted through the doorway whenever a customer entered, only to be immediately suffocated by the sharp, clinical smell of expensive floor polish and conditioned air that defined the interior of sterling oak. Inside, the atmosphere was frozen in an era of silent wealth. This was not a store where items had price tags attached to them. It was a sanctuary where timepieces were displayed with the same artistic reverence one might find in a private museum in Florence. Watches that cost more than a family home in the suburbs rested on deep, midnight blue velvet cushions under thick museum-grade glass, each one illuminated from below by a dedicated miniature LED spotlight that made the gold bezels and sapphire crystals gleam like sacred artifacts. The carpet beneath was a royal navy wool, woven so thick and dense that it completely absorbed the physics of movement. A person could stomp with all their might and produce no more than a muffled thud. Suspended from the exact center of the coffered ceiling was a massive grand chandelier, a cascading waterfall of hand-cut bohemian crystal that scattered thousands of tiny, cold, yellow diamonds of light across the dark mahogany paneling of the walls. The message of the space was absolute, woven into the very architecture of the boutique. You belong in this world, or you are an intruder. Into this silent theater of wealth walked a man who had to physically duck his head and turn his massive shoulders sideways just to clear the heavy brass frame of the entrance. 6 feet 9 inches tall, 250 pounds of dense, chiseled bone and muscle that moved with a quiet, terrifyingly deliberate fluidity. He did not stride into the room with the loud, aggressive posture of someone trying to command attention. Instead, he moved like a shadow, his weight shifting from heel to toe without a single rustle of his clothing. He wore a plain, unbranded black tech fleece jacket, the zipper pulled precisely halfway up his chest to reveal a hint of a simple black cotton t-shirt beneath. His trousers were dark, tailored sweatpants that hung loosely but perfectly over a pair of clean matte black sneakers, completely devoid of visible logos, stripes, or white rubber accents. No heavy gold chains hung from his neck. No diamond rings flashed on his massive fingers. No dark designer sunglasses obscured his face. To a casual observer who knew nothing of the world outside Savannah, he looked like nothing more than an exceptionally large man who had walked in from the crisp autumn afternoon to escape the wind. Behind him, keeping a strict distance of exactly 3 paces, was a compact, quiet man in his late 45s named Marcus Vance. Marcus wore a dark, perfectly fitted charcoal suit that allowed him to blend seamlessly into the background shadows of the room. His hands were clasped loosely in front of his waist, his fingers still, his eyes moving in slow, rhythmic arcs across the showroom floor. Marcus did not look at the watches. He looked at the people. He noted the position of the security cameras, the distance between the display cases, and the subtle shifts in posture of every individual in the room. He was a man who had spent 2 decades navigating high-pressure environments across the globe, from chaotic post-game press conferences to private airport tarmacs at midnight, and he knew how to read the temperature of a room before the occupants even realized they were sweating. The massive man in the black tech fleece was LeBron James. To the global public, he was a four-time world champion, a cultural icon, a living sports monument, and a billionaire whose financial empire stretched unto Hollywood production studios, private equity firms, and global marketing syndicates. But on this specific Saturday afternoon, the empire did not exist. The public brand was locked outside on Grand Avenue. LeBron was here for a reason that was entirely small, private, and heavy with the weight of memory. His mother, Gloria, was turning another year older in exactly 14 days. 30 years ago, when the two of them lived in a tiny, unheated apartment on the west side of Akron, Ohio, they had owned nothing but a rusted metal bed frame, a single plastic crate that served as a table, and an old water-damaged magazine they had found in a trash bin behind a grocery store. On one of the glossy pages of that magazine was a photograph of a vintage 1984 Rolex Datust, the exact year LeBron was born. The watch featured a textured champagne dial that looked like spun gold under the studio lights. Gloria had not asked for it. She had simply looked at the picture for a long, quiet minute, her thumb tracing the curved lines of the oyster case with a soft, tired smile before closing the magazine to go cook a dinner of boiled eggs and stale bread. That silent gesture from a mother who had sacrificed her entire youth so her son could have a pair of second-hand sneakers for junior high practice had lived in LeBron's chest for 3 decades. He had come to this specific boutique because an unlisted inventory report had indicated they possessed that exact vintage reference, untouched and preserved in its original box. He walked toward the rear display case, leaning his massive frame forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he found the champagne dial resting on its velvet pad. That was when Julian Vance stepped out from the private viewing room. The store director was 45 years old, his hair precisely parted and held in place by pomade that smelled faintly of sandalwood. He wore a bespoke charcoal 3-piece suit that had been pressed by hand that morning. At 6 o'clock, a silk burgundy pocket square peeking over the edge of his breast pocket like a drop of blood. Julian had spent 15 years in the upper echelons of luxury retail, moving from high-end jewelers in Manhattan to the historic districts of the South, and he possessed a professional skill of which he was intensely proud. The ability to execute an immediate, superficial triage of a human being's net worth within 3 seconds of them entering his domain. He looked at the massive man in the black tech fleece. He saw the absence of a watch on the left wrist. He saw the sweatpants. He saw the plain black sneakers. He noted the dark, unblemished skin and the sheer physical mass that did not fit within the delicate, Eurocentric proportions of the boutique. In Julian's mind, the evaluation was instantaneous and absolute. This man was a browser, a stray tourist who had wandered away from the riverfront bars, an athletic figure who belonged in a gymnasium, not a preferred client who could appreciate the horological heritage of a Swiss movement. "Excuse me," Julian said, his voice breaking the silence with a smooth, practiced cadence that managed to be entirely light on the surface, while carrying an unmistakable edge of ice underneath. He did not walk around the display counter to greet the man. Instead, he stood behind the glass barrier, his hands resting flat on the mahogany trim, his fingers slightly arched. "I am going to have to ask you to wait outside on the avenue. We are currently operating by private pre-arranged appointment only this afternoon for our corporate clients, and we simply do not have the capacity to accommodate walk-ins today." The lie was clean, but it was incredibly transparent. The showroom currently contained exactly 4 other people. In the far corner, an elderly woman in an olive trench coat sat comfortably at the custom service desk, an open catalog of diamond tennis bracelets in her lap, though no associate was actively speaking to her. Near the front window, a young couple in their 20s hovered over a case of engagement bands, holding hands in silence, completely unbothered by the staff. Near the grandfather clock, 2 middle-aged men in polo shirts stood whispering about their weekend golf scores, cardboard coffee cups resting on the ledges of the cases. None of them had an appointment. None of them had been asked to leave. The restriction was a velvet wall constructed solely for the giant in the black fleece jacket. The room went completely, devastatingly still. The low-frequency rumble of a passing carriage on the brick street outside died away, leaving only the sharp, synchronized ticking of the 24 antique clocks on the walls, a collective metallic pulse that suddenly sounded like a series of small hammers hitting iron. LeBron James did not flinch. He did not reach into his pocket to produce a line of credit, nor did he allow his jaw to tighten with the standard anger of a celebrity who had been denied recognition. He slowly straightened up to his full height, his head rising until it was mere inches below the lowest crystal pendant of the grand chandelier, his shadow falling across Julian's face like an eclipse. He looked down at the director through the yellow light, his dark eyes entirely calm, entirely blank, and entirely terrifying in their lack of emotion. He said absolutely nothing, and in that massive, unyielding silence, the air in the room became so heavy that Julian Vance found himself taking an involuntary, shallow breath, his hand gripping the edge of the mahogany counter just to maintain his balance against the invisible shift in power. To understand the specific, suffocating quality of the silence that followed, one must understand that time inside sterling oak timepieces did not move according to the laws of the outside world. The boutique was designed to be a vacuum, a space where the anxieties of the changing centuries could not penetrate. The temperature was maintained at a constant, unvarying 68 degrees Fahrenheit, a climate calculated to prevent the micro-lubricants inside balance wheels of the vintage movements from expanding or thinning. But on this afternoon, that coolness felt like the interior of a stone vault. The air was dry, lacking the humid weight of the Georgia coast, carrying only the faint, powdery scent of old paper documents and the expensive leather straps of the chronographs displayed along the northern wall. Julian Vance remained frozen in his professional stance, his chin tilted upward at a precise 45-degree angle to compensate for the massive vertical distance between himself and the customer. His face was a masterpiece of corporate composure, the skin around his eyes smooth, his lips set in a slight neutral curve that mimicked a smile without actually becoming one. But beneath the charcoal vest of his three-piece suit, his ribs were tight. His lungs were operating on shallow, rapid cycles, his heart rate ticking upward like the second hand of a mechanical stopwatch. He could feel the eyes of the other customers shifting toward him. He had spent his entire adult life believing that luxury was an exclusive club, a fortress whose value was determined entirely by the height of its walls and the severity of its gatekeepers. He had been trained to believe that people like the man before him, men who wore fleece and walked with the loose, heavy stride of the working districts, were meant to look through the glass from the sidewalk, not stand on the Royal Navy wool. Across from him, LeBron James did not shift his weight by a single millimeter. A normal person, when confronted with a public rejection, would have adjusted their posture, looked down at their phone, or cleared their throat to relieve the social friction that was beginning to burn the edges of the room. LeBron did none of these things. He possessed the rare, absolute physical stillness that belongs only to those who have spent their lives under the white-hot glare of stadium lights. Men who have learned that every twitch of a muscle, every blink of an eye, is a piece of data that can be used by an enemy. His large, scarred hands remained loose at his sides, his fingers slightly curled but completely relaxed, his thumbs brushing lightly against the fabric of his sweatpants. His gaze did not wander to the chandelier or the mahogany walls. It stayed fixed on Julian's face, tracking the microscopic movement of the manager's pupils, observing the tiny, pale circle of sweat that was beginning to form on the director's starch-white collar. It was the same look of cold, predatory assessment he used when an opposing coach committed a critical strategic error in the final seconds of a playoff game. A look that acknowledged the mistake without offering the charity of an immediate reaction. Near the entrance, Marcus Vance moved with the quiet precision of an engineer. He did not step forward to defend LeBron. He did not raise his voice or demand to speak to the corporate owners of the franchise. Instead, he took one slow step backward until his shoulder blades were within 2 inches of the heavy brass door frame, effectively blocking the exit without appearing to do so. His arms were crossed loosely over his chest, his head tilted slightly to the left, as he recorded every face in the room. Marcus knew that in situations like this, noise was the weapon of the weak. He knew that the man in the black tech fleece did not need an advocate. He needed an observer. He watched the elderly woman at the desk, whose hand had frozen mid-air as she went to turn the page of her catalog. He watched the young couple near the window, their whispered conversation about diamond clarity dying instantly in their throats as they felt the sudden drop in the room's temperature. The space between the two men became an actual, physical weight. The 24 clocks on the walls seemed to lose their individual rhythms, their gears locking into a single, massive, metallic heartbeat that filled the ears of everyone present. The light from the crystal chandelier, which had seemed so warm and welcoming when LeBron first entered, now felt sharp and clinical, casting long, stark shadows across the navy carpet that looked like black iron bars. The 4 witnesses in the boutique had become part of the display, transformed into silent marble statues by the sheer density of the social confrontation. No one moved, no one spoke. The silence was no longer an absence of sound. It had become an active, pressurized force that was slowly pushing the air out of Julian Vance's lungs, forcing him to confront the terrifying reality that he had drawn a line in the sand, and the giant before him had not even bothered to look down at it. As LeBron James stood in the center of that expensive room, the gold light of the Savannah boutique began to dissolve around the edges of his vision, replaced by the harsh, flickering neon of a broken street lamp on Hickory Street in Akron, Ohio. It was January 1995. The temperature outside was 7 degrees below zero, and the fierce winter wind coming off Lake Erie was rattling the loose sheets of plywood that the city had nailed over the shattered windows of the abandoned apartment complex next door. He was 11 years old, his long, thin legs tucked tightly against his chest as he sat on a blue plastic milk crate in the unheated concrete hallway of their building, his knees aching from a sudden growth spurt that had already made him taller than every adult on the floor. He remembered the smell of that hallway with a clarity that felt like a physical burn in the back of his throat. The heavy, sour odor of damp wool coats that never fully dried, the smell of boiled rich from the neighbor's kitchen, and the sharp chemical tang of kerosene from the portable heater that an old man on the first floor kept running to stay alive. He remembered looking down at his shoes, a pair of worn-out sneakers that had belonged to an older cousin, the rubber soles worn down so thin that he could feel every ridge and crack in the cold cement beneath his feet. His mother, Gloria, had walked through the heavy steel security doors at the end of the hall at precisely 7:45 p.m. Her face was pale from the biting cold, her breath rising in thick, white plumes that lingered in the stagnant air of the corridor. She was wearing a faded denim jacket she had borrowed from a friend, the sleeves 3 inches too short for her wrists, leaving her raw, chapped hands exposed to the freezing draft. She had spent the last 4 hours walking through the snow, from one retail store to another on the south side of the city, looking for a seasonal position behind a cash wrap shirt. She had been turned away 3 times before she could even fill out an application. The last manager had looked at her worn jacket, looked at the address of the public housing complex she had written down, and told her, without blinking, that they were looking for someone with a more professional presentation. Gloria had not shed a single tear in front of her son. She had walked straight down the hallway, her boots squeaking against the salt-stained floor, and she had knelt down on the cold concrete directly in front of his milk crate. She took his massive, freezing hands into her own, her skin rough and split from the winter wind. But her grip possessed a warmth that felt like a furnace to the 11-year-old boy. "Look at me, LeBron," she had whispered, her voice low and completely steady, despite the visible tremor in her jaw from the cold. "You look right at me. This world out there is always going to try to tell you who you are before you even get a chance to show them your name. They are going to look at where we sleep. They are going to look at what we don't have in our pockets. And they are going to think they've already read your whole story from the cover. You hear me? You don't ever let them write a single line of your book for you. You keep your head up, you keep your mouth shut, and you let your work do all the talking. Your dignity is something they can't touch unless you hand it over to them. You are more than what their eyes can see." That night, they had sat on the floor of their single room, sharing a single box of generic macaroni and cheese that she had cooked over a hot plate using a plastic fork they had saved from a fast food counter, because their regular utensils had been left behind during their last sudden eviction. There was no television to provide noise, no radio to block out the sound of the wind screaming through the alleys outside. There was only the steady, calm rhythm of his mother's voice as she talked about the apartment they were going to have one day, the kitchen with a real stove, and the future she was going to carve out for him with her bare hands. She had moved him 12 times in the span of just 36 months, packing their entire lives into heavy black plastic trash bags in the middle of the night, walking through the snow from one temporary room to another, just to keep him 3 blocks away from the street gangs and the drug markets that were swallowing the other boys on their block. She had given up her meals, her pride, her health, and every comfort a young woman could want, solely to ensure that the small circle around her son remained unbroken by the chaos of the city. The memory shifted, expanding into the brighter, louder light of his sophomore year at St. Vincent St. Mary High School. He remembered the first time a national television crew had set up their heavy tripods and industrial lights along the sidelines of their cramped school gymnasium. He was 16 years old, a child from the neighborhood being heralded on magazine covers as the chosen successor to the history of a global game. The pressure was no longer an abstract concept. It was a physical weight that sat on his chest every single morning when his alarm went off at 5:00 a.m., forcing him to run sprints in the dark until his lungs tasted like copper. The scouts, the sports executives, and the veteran journalists would sit in the front rows with their leather-bound notebooks open, their eyes tracking his every gesture, his every breath, his every reaction to a missed shot or a hard foul. They were not just looking for talent, they were looking for a flaw. They were waiting for a teenager from a broken home to lose his temper, or to scream at a referee, to push a teammate, or to show a single crack in his composure that would allow them to write the story they had already prepared in their minds, the story of another gifted kid to handle the light, who didn't have the discipline to handle the light. His coaches had pounded the same rule into his mind until it became a physical reflex. When they expect you to explode, you become completely still. Your silence is the wall they can't climb. The tension inside sterling oak timepieces did not remain static. It advanced with the slow, crushing weight of a glacier, narrowing the physical space between Julian Vance and the silent giant before him. Julian's fingers, still resting on the polished mahogany trim of the counter, tightened until his manicured nails turned a sharp, brittle white. The small diamond signet ring on his finger caught the reflection of the chandelier, flashing like a warning beacon in the dim corners of the showroom. He could feel the eyes of the 4 wealthy clients burning into his back, his professional reputation, a fragile construct built on 15 years of selective snobbery, hanging by a thread on the public floor. In his mind, the silence of the massive customer was not an act of dignity. It was an act of open defiance, a direct challenge to the invisible borders he had spent his career enforcing. "I will not ask you again, sir," Julian said, his voice dropping into a low, harsh register that completely stripped away the last remaining veneer of retail politeness. He reached down into his vest pocket, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, and pulled out a small black internal communications radio. He did not look at LeBron's face as he pressed the talk button, his thumb trembling slightly against the plastic casing. "Marcus, I need private security at the Grand Avenue entrance immediately. We have an individual on the floor who is refusing to comply with our weekend scheduling directives and is disrupting the environment for our preferred clients." The word individual was delivered like an insult, a cold legal term used to strip the man in the black tech fleece of his humanity. In the background, the mechanics of the room reacted instantly to the escalation. The 2 middle-aged men near the golf display set their cardboard coffee cups down on the glass ledger with a synchronized, dull thud, their faces flushing with an uncomfortable mixture of curiosity and secondary shame. They did not speak to defend the stranger. Instead, one of them took a slow step backward, his leather loafers squeaking against the wood border of the navy carpet, turning his shoulder completely away from the center of the room as if trying to erase his own presence from the scene. The young couple near the window stopped looking at the diamond bands altogether. The young man gripped his partner's elbow with a sudden firm pressure, pulling her 2 steps closer to the heavy brass exit door, his eyes wide with the raw instinct to escape before the tension turned into physical violence. LeBron James did not break his frame by a single fraction of an inch. He stood with his feet planted wide on the thick royal wool, his center of gravity entirely lowered, his broad chest rising and falling in a deep, unbroken cycle of breath that seemed to rhythmically measure the panic of the manager before him. He did not pull out his phone to show his balance. He did not mention his global partnerships. He did not offer the director the cheap satisfaction of a verbal defense. He simply allowed the manager's words to land completely, absorbing the full weight of the public humiliation without giving Julian a single target for retaliation. The sheerness of his physical mass, combined with the absolute freezing calm of his expression, transformed him from a target into a judge. The power in the room had shifted entirely away from the corporate desk. It now lived in the heavy, unyielding silence of the man who refused to become a reaction. At the far end of the service wrap, Caleb Brooks felt the cold current of the room enter his bones like a physical sickness. His right hand was still pressed flat against the microfiber cloth, the fabric leaving a faint, damp smudge of sweat on the silver display tray he had been polishing for the last 40 minutes. His mind was entirely disconnected from the luxury chronographs and the strict rules of the boutique. It was locked inside the small zipper pocket of his backpack in the break room. In that pocket lay a folded piece of lined notebook paper covered in blue ink, a detailed, desperate breakdown of his tuition balance for his final semester at Savannah State University, his past-due utility notices, and the remaining monthly payments on his late father's medical debts. Caleb had spent his childhood in a small, white-frame house near the shipping terminals of the Savannah River, an industrial neighborhood where the evening air always carried the thick, sulfurous smell of the paper mills and the heavy rumble of diesel engines. His father, David Brooks, had been a master mechanic at the municipal transit garage, a man who had spent 40 years lying on his back, on freezing concrete floors, his large fingers permanently stained with deep black engine oil that no amount of industrial soap could ever fully wash away. David had been a man of immense quiet pride, a man who never asked for a cash advance and never skipped a single hour of work, even when his lungs began to crack and fail him during his final years. On Sunday nights, David would wash his hands with pumice, sit on the worn velvet sofa in the living room, and watch LeBron James play basketball on a 13-inch television screen. Caleb remembered those winter Sundays with a clarity that felt like an actual physical ache in his ribs. His father would point his grease-stained index finger at the screen whenever LeBron was hit hard in the paint, whenever a hostile arena would chant insults, or whenever a commentator would question his character on national television. "You look at him, Caleb," his father would whisper, his voice raspy from the exhaust fumes of the transit garage. "Look how they try to make him dirty. Look how they try to make him jump out of his skin so they can call him a villain. And look how he just stays in his frame. He don't yell. He don't curse. He just puts the ball in the hoop and he walks back down that floor like a king who owns the building." That is how a real man handles small people. You don't match their noise. You match your own results. David Brooks had died in a crowded ward 2 years ago, leaving behind a rusted metal toolbox, a stack of worn sports magazines, and a son who was currently working 30 hours a week for minimum wage just to cross a graduation stage. Caleb looked at Julian Vance's profile, the sharp, cold line of his jaw, the absolute lack of human empathy in his pale eyes, and he felt a sudden hot wave of ancient shame wash over his collar. He remembered the other times he had stayed quiet behind this counter. He remembered the older rural couple who had saved for 6 months to buy a graduation gift, only to be turned away by Julian under the pretense of a private viewing. Caleb had stayed still that day, his eyes locked on the floor, his mouth shut by the raw fear of losing his hourly check. When he went home that night, the dinner his mother had left for him tasted like gravel. Caleb looked back at LeBron James. He saw the large, rough scar on the superstar's right index finger, a small physical detail he had seen in 100 photographs on his father's workbench. He saw the absolute unbroken dignity of the man standing in the center of the floor. Caleb felt the heavy stone in his stomach turn into something solid, something dangerous. He thought about his father's rough hands. He thought about the 40 years of dignity his father had maintained on that cold garage floor for $12 an hour. Caleb set the microfiber cloth down on the glass counter with a slow, deliberate movement that felt like breaking a chain. He did not look at his manager. He stepped out from the safety of the cash-wrapped desk, his leather-soled shoes making a sharp, distinct crack against the deep navy carpet as he entered the center of the showroom. "Mr. James," Caleb said, his voice cutting through the heavy silence of the boutique like a clean stone skipped across still water. "Welcome to Sterling Oak. My name is Caleb. It would be my absolute privilege to assist you with our vintage collection this afternoon." The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Julian Vance spun around so quickly that his charcoal jacket flared at the side vents, his face turning a deep mottled purple beneath his pomaded hair. He took 2 long, aggressive steps toward Caleb, his right hand coming up in a sharp, territorial gesture as if he were trying to physically shove the young clerk back into the shadows of the service wrap. "Caleb," Julian said, his voice dropping into a low, venomous whisper that carried the full weight of a professional execution. "You are completely out of turn. Go to the manager's office immediately, log out of your terminal, and pack your personal items. Your shift with this firm is concluded." Caleb did not blink. He did not look at Julian's face, which was now sweating profusely under the yellow light of the chandelier. He kept his eyes locked onto LeBron James, his posture straight, his arms loose at his sides. "I am staying on the floor, Mr. Vance," Caleb said, his voice remaining remarkably soft, but possessing an iron density that surprised everyone in the room. "This gentleman asked to see our historical inventory, and as an associate of this firm, I am going to show it to him." LeBron James looked down at Caleb Brooks. It was a look that lasted no more than 2 seconds, but it carried the weight of an entire lifetime of understanding across a divided room. In those dark eyes, Caleb did not see the distant glare of a global celebrity. He saw the recognition of a peer. He saw a man who knew exactly what that moment was costing a 22-year-old kid with $43 in his checking account. LeBron did not smile, but the hard line of his jaw relaxed by a fraction of an inch, his fingers flattening against his sweatpants. "I appreciate that, Caleb," LeBron said, his voice a deep, resonant bass that filled the small boutique like water filling a dry well, vibrating the glass of the display cases. "I'm looking for the 1984 Oyster Steel, Datagist with the textured champagne dial. My mother likes things that last." Caleb walked straight past his manager, his shoulder brushing against Julian's charcoal sleeve without a single acknowledgement of the older man's presence. He went to the secure safe at the back of the showroom, entered his personal digital employee code, and brought out the velvet tray containing the specific vintage timepiece. He placed it on the glass counter with both hands, his movements precise, respectful, and entirely focused on the object. For the next 10 minutes, Caleb spoke about the watch not as a piece of luxury status, but as a masterpiece of human engineering. He talked about the caliber 3035 movement, the introduction of the quick-set date feature in the early 80s, and how the textured dial was designed to reflect light differently depending on the angle of the afternoon sun. He talked to LeBron James the way his father used to talk about the engines of classic buses, with a deep, unpretentious respect for craftsmanship. LeBron listened without a single interruption, his massive frame leaning over the mahogany trim of the counter. He picked up the watch with his thumb and forefinger, holding it up to the yellow light of the chandelier. The champagne dial caught the reflection, glowing with a soft, warm light that matched the color of the autumn sun outside the window. He turned it over, looking at the brushed steel of the oyster case, his finger tracing the smooth curve of the lugs. He stayed in that position for a long, quiet minute, a man completely insulated from the anger and panic that was still vibrating off the store director a few feet away. "I'll take it," LeBron said softly, setting the watch back down on the velvet pad. "And I want you to process the sale under your personal employee identification number, Caleb." The completion of the transaction was carried out with the efficiency of a ritual. Julian Vance remained standing near the front display window, his body rigid, his hands tucked inside his trousers pockets to hide their violent shaking. He did not offer to help. He did not speak to the other clients. He simply watched his authority evaporate in the middle of his own floor. The elderly woman at the service desk stood up slowly, walked to the counter where Caleb was processing the card, and laid a small, handwritten business card next to the register. She looked at Caleb, gave him a short, firm nod of her head, and walked out into the afternoon air without purchasing a single thing. Marcus Vance stepped forward from the doorway as the receipt finished printing. He took the neatly wrapped box from Caleb's hands, the ivory paper and black silk ribbon looking clean against his dark suit. Marcus looked at the young clerk, his careful eyes softening for the first time since he had entered the building. "You have a good night, young man," Marcus said quietly. "You did your father proud today." LeBron James took his copy of the receipt, folding it twice before sliding it into the pocket of his tech fleece. He looked at Julian Vance one final time, a long, cold look that carried no anger, only the flat finality of a judge delivering a sentence. He turned his massive shoulders, walked through the double glass doors, and stepped out onto the brick sidewalk of Grand Avenue, his shadow disappearing into the long evening light of the city. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind them. The room exhaled, a collective, audible release of held breath from the remaining customers. Caleb stood behind the counter, his hands resting on the cold marble trim of the register terminal. He looked down at the empty velvet pad where the 1984 Rolex had rested just moments before. 30 minutes later, the store's private security shutters were lowered for the night, the metal slab blocking out the light from the street lamps. Julian Vance walked out of his private office, his jacket removed, his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He did not look at Caleb as he laid a white envelope on the counter. "Your services are no longer required at Sterling Oak," Julian said, his voice flat, dry, and completely devoid of its professional smoothness. "Your performance on the floor today was a direct violation of our client management protocols. You can collect your personal items from the break room locker. Your final check will be mailed to your address on file within 14 business days." Caleb did not look at the envelope. He did not argue. He did not threaten a lawsuit. He walked into the back room, took his backpack and his worn leather notebook from the locker, and walked out through the rear exit into the dark alleyway behind Grand Avenue. The air smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. He had $43 in his checking account. His rent was due in less than 2 weeks. He stood under the single bulb of the alleyway light, adjusted the straps of his backpack, and began the 2-mile walk back to his apartment in the rain. He was completely unemployed, but for the first time in his 22 years, his chest felt completely light. The machinery of a modern empire moves with an architectural silence. Following that Saturday in Savannah, LeBron James did not launch a public boycott or leak the story to entertainment blogs. He understood that a public scandal is a temporary fire. It burns hot for 48 hours and disappears, leaving the structure unchanged. He was looking for a permanent relocation of power. On Monday morning, Glenn Favreau, a real estate attorney managing private property acquisitions for LeBron's family office, filed corporate requests at the Chatham County Registry of Deeds. The target was the historic 4-story brick structure at 412 Grand Avenue, the building housing Sterling Oak timepieces. The property passed quietly into the hands of Oak and Iron Holdings LLC, a holding company owned by the kid from the Akron projects. LeBron did not evict the boutique. Instead, his legal team attached a mandatory landlord rider to the lease renewal. It required the tenant to submit to a semi-annual independent audit of their public-facing operations and granted the landlord the absolute right to review all management-level personnel terminations, ensure compliance with fair accommodation guidelines. If the corporate office in Atlanta refused, the lease was void, costing them millions in holiday revenue. They signed within 48 hours. By mid-December, the corporate office reviewed the showroom's high-definition security footage and an audio recording taken by another client. The vice president of human resources called Julian Vance directly. Facing the immediate threat of a lease termination, the corporate board stripped Julian of his title, terminated him for gross violation of company ethics, and blacklisted him from luxury retail management across the region. His 15-year career, built entirely on exclusivity and pride, was dismantled by a single 5-minute phone call. He walked out into the Savannah rain, finally understanding what it felt like to stand on the outside of a locked door. A week before Christmas, Caleb Brooks sat at his small kitchen table, staring at a stack of unpaid bills. The doorbell rang. A quiet man in a dark suit handed him a thick black envelope sealed with a gold wax stamp bearing the initials of LRMR Ventures. Inside was a personal letter signed by hand in thick black ink. True leadership is the choice to step out into the room when stepping back is the easiest thing to do, the letter read. You stood up for my mother's dignity and your father's memory. Now, let's make sure you have the tools to stand up for others. Underneath lay a certified corporate grant from the LeBron James Family Foundation, a full tuition scholarship covering his remaining semesters at Savannah State University, his textbooks, and a monthly housing stipend of $1,500, marked as settled in full. Along with it came an official offer for a summer internship within the commercial real estate development division of Spring Hill Company in Los Angeles. Caleb sat in the quiet room, his eyes blurring as he looked at the ink and dialed his mother's number to tell her she never had to worry about their winter bills again. Months later, the early morning sun rose over Akron, Ohio. Gloria James sat at her oak kitchen table, a porcelain mug of black coffee steaming in front of her. On her left wrist was the vintage 1984 Rolex Datjust. The gold and steel links caught the clean morning light, the champagne dial glowing softly. She touched the side of the bezel with one finger. A private gesture of peace, remembering the long journey that had started in a freezing apartment. In downtown Orlando, Caleb Brooks stood by the window of his new office, holding a blueprint for a community center. Folded inside his top drawer was the letter from Akron. Whenever a difficult decision arrived on his desk, Caleb would touch that gold wax seal and remember the cold floor of sterling oak. The response was complete, moving quietly through the lives of everyone it had touched, proving that the loudest sound in the world is always the one made by a good man standing his ground in the silence.